Shabbat Shalom and welcome to Living Waters, Falling Deeper in Love with God's Word. I am one of your hosts, Lauren Cruz.
And I am another host, Stephanie Pablantos, in case you don't know that already, but hopefully we have some new viewers too.
And our name is on the screen. Thanks for joining us. So we originally thought we would be doing this live on Friday night. However, something has come up. And so we're pre-recording this earlier in the week, but you are joining us on Friday. So thank you for joining us. Mm-hmm. Please interact. Please put comments. Please, make any comments and questions that you might have for today's lesson. We always jump back on and go through everything and try to follow up when we can. So yeah,
we do. Right. So yeah, we like to see the comments and we like to see questions. So
we do. So we decided, since we kind of cut things short last week a little, I know we talked about going forward and reading through the first half of the book with Passover, but there was a lot in the second aspect of it where it talks
chapter
about
11.
Yeah, chapter 11 and the Feast of Tabernacles. We're still talking about that, the return of Jesus.
Yep.
We didn't want to just skip it. We kind of thought that there was a lot of information, and so we're gonna slow it down a little bit. So if you have read ahead and you're all ready for Passover, good. You'll be ahead of us, and we'll have such a frantic week next week to keep reading and keep up. But we're going to just back that up a little bit. We're going to review the things that we didn't want to skip over. And then we're actually going to go back to chapter 1, where he just kind of introduces the whole premise. Because when we started, we kind of skipped that chapter and we just added a few things that we thought were important.
Very quickly.
Yeah. But so we want to go back and we want to kind of dig into chapter 1. So next week, we'll start talking about Passover, and you're ahead of us. If you have read ahead, good. That's fine. So, all right.
Good
Stephanie.
Good
chapter
book.
11. Yeah. So we've been reading it backwards, but it's biblical feast and the return of Jesus. Mm-hmm. I've learned a lot, and I definitely have had a deeper appreciation. I think it's good that we started on the fall feast, and you kind of really had a better understanding of what's going on.
I do too. I'm really glad that we started there because. And I wish we would have even gotten ahead, but we weren't there. We were still finishing another book, so we couldn't start this one when the feasts were right on our doorstep. But I next year I feel like I will have a better understanding of all the feasts as they come around, because I really do think that this book has taught me a lot. So I'm recommending this book to everyone. So I'm constantly telling people about it. If you want to understand why, it's because the thing I like about it is that he has a historical chapter and then a futuristic chapter on the same feast, as we've said. But there's also parts in both of those chapters where you can take what it means to me today, what it means to me right now.
I agree.
So, and I think that is great because it's not just about the past. It's about how it can still be fulfilled right now in our lives. So that's what I like.
Agree. I know my mom had said, she's disabled. She's not able to build a sukkah out back, but, she's able to sit outside. She's able to, have a meal outside. She's able, there's different things that you can do, to kind of, this is what I can do, and this is my offering kind of attitude, never hid this. My husband doesn't follow the messianic aspect of the faith. He is staunch church Christian, which is fine. So for me to say, hey, let's build a whole sukkah out back, I don't think I could have gotten him to do it, but we have a pergola. I can decorate it. I can put pompons and flowers and things like that up, and we can have dinner outside a couple of nights a week, during that festival time. So, and God knows your heart. God knows the desire to at least acknowledge and understand, because we've said this a lot. These feasts are rehearsals for how we're going to be living with Yeshua in the millennial kingdom. It's going to be very Jewish looking, and so the best that we can practice and learn about it here will make that transition a little easier.
Exactly. And your mom was cute because she texted me like on Facebook Messenger, and she said, "You put up a sukkah?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Would you send me a picture?" So I did.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So she could see it. So, she's like, "I'm not able to do that." And I go, "Hey, that's okay. I understand."
That's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You can
We do what we can.
Seriously.
Yeah. We do what we can, and we talk about it as much as we can. It's okay.
And really understanding the meaning and what I mean, if you're unable to build one, just study and think, because again, we talked about this last week, but we all go through wilderness times. Right. And wilderness times are when you feel alone, when you might feel isolated, like God is not even hearing you or listening. So those are what we call wilderness times. So you can, if you've been through that wilderness time, and your mom probably feels like that a lot because of her isolation. But but I'm sure that you can then thank the Lord when you come out of those wilderness times. And that's what this feast is about. Like we made it through the wilderness, and I only did it with the Lord's help. So, and keeping that in mind when you think of those things. So.
Well, how does it apply to the future? So that's what we're going to talk about.
That's what we're going to talk about.
That's what our chapter is. So last week we got the historical aspects of it, time of the year, what they do. It involves a lot of food. He made a comment in here. We call these holidays the feasts, but really this is the one that is the feast.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point.
They're not really feasts. In fact, Yom Kippur is a fast.
Yes. So actually, the way we celebrate it, of course, by fasting, we keep it, we remember it, I should say, because it's not really a celebration when you're fasting. But I think what we kind of do is we break the fast together. So we had a meal to break the fast together. So that was, and then we had we had teaching that day, so to understand more about it. And I like here on 234, the last paragraph on that page, he kind of summarizes the fall feast. So he says, the first two fall feasts officially establish, again, his or Jesus' kingship, whereas the Feast of Tabernacles is the time to rejoice in his presence and to acknowledge that he is now living among and ruling his people. Right. So,
and that's really the premise of it, how he tabernacles or he dwells among us. And so that will be the key theme for this one, because as we go into the millennial kingdom, that's when he will be dwelling with us. So, he does begin to talk about, I thought it should not surprise us. This is at the top of page 235. Should not surprise us that the Hebrew prophets, these are Old Testament prophets, frequently spoke of events in the millennial kingdom using language and themes associated with the Feast of Torah, with the feasts in Torah. And this is something that Stephanie and I are really starting to get sensitive to, is the language of the Bible, whether it's a covenant language or Eden language or feast language. And in this case, it actually, anytime you're talking about an abundance and harvest and rains, and so know the feasts, and then you'll know the language of the feasts. And I know a plug for the gospel, the creation gospel. She actually looks at the 7 churches of Revelation, and she assigns a day to each. A day of creation to the menorah, and then the 7 churches gets assigned to the menorah, and she also assigns the feasts. And when you read, the messages to the churches, you see language, and when you understand the feasts, you pick up on it. Like abundance, and there's different language that associates with it.
Yeah, and I actually have all of those marked with the feasts they go with. I mean, you probably have it somewhere too, but I wrote them down in Revelation with each church. And so where like the church in Ephesus is Passover, and even like,
which one do you know real quick? Which one goes with Tabernacle?
Yeah, I will look. The Feast of Sukkot is the Laodicea. So yeah, Yom Kippur is Philadelphia.
When you go and you begin to read through that, then you start seeing language. So he in the book, he talks about in Zechariah, it specifically says Feast of the Tabernacles. And I mean, so it gives us a time frame. And then in, where's the other one? He was talking about in Joel. Joel is talking about early rains as before, who has dwelt wondrously among you. So, I mean, that's all language of tabernacles. So,
and I have written down, because somebody said it along the line, but in Revelation 1, starting in 9, when it says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and in the kingdom and the patient endurance, sorry, I'm trying to read too fast, that are in Jesus, was on an island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, which is the Sabbath. It's Saturday.
Sunday, yeah.
And I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And I have marked here, this was the Feast of Trumpets that he got this.
Interesting.
This vision that he received all this.
Interesting.
So yeah. So because the Lord's day, I also have written the day of the Lord. So often there's overlap. You know, the Lord's day is used for Shabbat, but it's also sometimes used in connection with the end times, the day of the Lord.
Right.
So yeah. So that's just some notes I had when you brought that up. It made me think, I've got that written down.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. One of the things I liked on page 236, which is kind of discussing this because it's talking about the language and things, it says, as we saw in the last chapter, Sukkot was a time to celebrate the prior year's harvest and the time to entreat God to send later rains. It's a guarantee that the agricultural harvest of the next year. Moreover, in the time of Jesus, it was through the water libation ceremony, which we talked about last time. And it makes perfect sense that in the millennial kingdom, the observance of Sukkot will once again be tied to the later rains and the provision of the king, just as it was in ancient Israel. And so one thing he says is it's not that these things aren't fulfilled, because he gave us the pattern. He gave us the pattern in life, and the pattern is after, heaven. And so if things are happening with an exodus, or things are happening with the way they celebrated, then we need to anticipate that that's going to be fulfilled again in the millennial kingdom. So,
and I don't think that many people, and I just want to go back one page to 235, but in Zechariah 14, 16 through 19, it actually is talking about this millennial kingdom. And he talks about this will be the punishment, because basically he's saying, if you don't come to Jerusalem, and before I actually say that, just keep in mind that this is all like after the tribulation, after everything has happened, after the cleanup, after the purification, after the temple has been built, everything like that. But there will be survivors of what we think of the tribulation, Armageddon, whatever. There will be survivors. So some of these survivors are there just because they survived, not necessarily followers of Yeshua. And so basically it says the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the king. So these survivors, these people have to acknowledge that he's king. So it says they will worship the king, the Lord Almighty, to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles.
The festival.
And if they don't, and this verse specifically talks about the Egyptian people. If they don't go up and they will have no rain. And again, remember, that's what the Jewish people prayed for at this time. So that's a big deal. And so I thought it was interesting. And he just goes on, at this time, people from the nations will acknowledge God's rule and honor him for blessing them in the prior year, which will continue, or which will ensure their harvest in the following year. So, so I thought that was interesting. And often you hear people say that verse, but you don't think about it that
it's in the future.
Yeah,
that's in the
future with the future temple,
right?
God's throne,
right? Yeah.
So that was a really good point. And then the other one he mentions is Joel 2,
right,
21. Do you want to read that one?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think that's a good word. And again, listen to the language, right?
Do not fear, O land, rejoice and be glad, for the Lord has done great things. Do not fear the field, for the pastures and the wilderness have turned green, for the trees have borne its fruit, the fig tree and the vine have yielded in full. O rejoice, O sons of Zion, be glad in the Lord your God, for he has given you, and here's a word, early rain for your vindication. He has poured down the rain, and early and later rains as before, and the threshing floors will be full of grain. That's all Sukkot language, and the vats will overflow with new wine, new oil. Again, all Sukkot language because of what's harvested in the fall. You'll have plenty to eat, be satisfied, praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dwelt wondrously with you. May your people never be put to shame. So that's all in Joel 2, 21 through 26.
Yeah. So again, so he just goes on to say, first, God tells the sons of Zion to rejoice and be glad, which again is that language. Second, God mentions early and latter rains, which will cause the threshing floors to be full of grain, like you said. And then finally, God speaks of the fig trees and the grapevines yielding a full harvest. So he brings out those three things in the next paragraph that this is Sukkot language, and I thought that was really interesting.
And again, future. That's a future event. So
and before we move on, I just at the bottom of 237, I thought it was interesting that he brought up today, like where we live, what we're doing, how we eat today. And he said we live in a world of pollution and depleted soil, and and we don't understand that our soils are depleted because we do not give our soils rest like God commanded. So to the extent that even the best produce we can find is inferior by God's standard. So in the millennium, the earth will be purified as in the days of the Garden of Eden. And the bounty from the natural world will be extravagantly rich. And people will enjoy a wealth of amazing fruits that far surpass what our minds can now fathom. So I think that was interesting because, I mean, the food that we'll have later, it's like, I guess, I mean, I think like to eat an apple, it will not be like the apples we have. I mean, it will be like,
do you know, I was at I was at somewhere. It was a speaker, and she was telling us that an orange from 30 years ago had higher nutritional value than one that we would eat today, or an apple. So even though we're eating an apple, we're thinking, oh, I'm being healthy, I'm eating raw fruit. They don't have the same nutritional value that it did even 20, 30 years ago.
No. And my husband and I do a lot of nutritional stuff with people and talk to people who are struggling with, eating right and eating better. And it's like, we have to take supplements nowadays because we don't get enough from our food.
You're not getting it in our food. Yeah.
It's really sad, but think of, think of how they described in like Numbers, the book of Numbers, when they went to go in and they saw these giants, with grapes that took 2 men to carry. I mean, that's what we're talking about in the Millennial Kingdom. We're talking about that kind of
back to that, right?
Kind of stuff, that kind of food. Yeah. So
that'd be great.
Interesting. It's something to look forward besides everything else, right?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Are we ready to move on, or is there anything else?
I know there's a couple of things here on 238 and 239 that, again, the tabernacle or the Sukkot language in Luke 22
Isaiah.
and Isaiah 25:6. So yeah, so he points those things out, which I think is a really good thing to do, because we can see it then when we look in.
Yeah. And this is where he has the quote, interestingly, though we call the appointed times of Leviticus 23 feasts in English, none of them, besides the Feast of Tabernacle, is actually centered around proper feasting in their original historical context. So I guess we should probably get in the habit of just calling them Moedim.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, other than like Passover, it is a meal. But again, we don't really like, we also have to understand, and I think he actually put it in here. Yeah, the Passover meal originally included only lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs.
Yeah.
So we add a whole lot more, or Judaism has added a whole lot more to it, and we like it that way. But technically, you could sit in your house and celebrate Passover by eating these three things: a lamb hamburger or something, you know, and a salad with romaine, because that's a bitter herb. I mean, it's really simple to do. So we just make it more of a celebration and a bigger deal.
We do.
But I actually bought a book. I wish I have it behind that curtain, but it's basically the biblical feasts, and they go through like exactly like the biblical Passover. I'm sorry. Like exactly how, the Lord told him to celebrate Passover, and not how it's celebrated in Judaism. So, yeah, interesting.
It is interesting. It is. All right. He also brought up on page 239 something that Stephanie really picked up on, and she liked this. But he references a passage in 1 Kings 8, 1 through 11, and this is when Solomon was bringing the ark into the newly built temple, and the glory of the Lord is filling the temple. And what were you talking about, Stephanie? What did you notice?
So it never dawned on me that, again, and I'll just read this part.
Again,
it says,
so it's because we're now paying attention to Sukkot language.
Yes. So 1 Kings 8, 1 through 11, and I'm not going to read them all. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes and leaders of the father's household of the sons of Israel to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion.
Right.
All of the men of Israel assembled themselves to King Solomon at the feast in the month of, we were trying to figure out how to say this, Ethaim. It looks like Ethan or something, Ethaim, but which is the 7th month, which is the month of the fall.
That's right.
Then all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. They brought up the ark to the Lord in the tent of meeting and all the holy utensils which are in the tent, and the priests and the Levites brought them up. But then it goes on that God fills the temple. So he goes in, and if you remember, there's like smoke and everything coming into the cloud and smoke and stuff. And it says, it happened that when the priest came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And he goes on to say, Sukkot celebrates, and this is the author, Sukkot celebrates that God dwells among his people and reigns as their king. And this is why the glory of the Lord filled his house during Sukkot in the days of Solomon.
Right.
And I had no idea. I had not read it that way.
We don't pay attention. We just read it quick, and
it's like that. Everything that's significant in the Bible happened around a feast
day or around a feast.
Yeah. So when you read like the book of John in the Gospels, everything that Jesus is doing is around either a Sabbath or a Moedim.
Right. And we talked about that when he talks about how he is living waters. That's right after the water libation ceremony. When he says, I am the light of the world, it's right after the menorahs were lit at the last day of Sukkot. So
Yeah.
Everything is on a timeline, and it is identified, but we read it quickly and we're not paying attention to the language.
Right.
I'm guilty of it.
Yeah, and it's really cool when you see that. But the last thing I had this like starred, and so when I start something, it's like, okay, I really love this. It says, however, 1 Kings 8 does indicate, even if only in a general way, that the Feast of Tabernacle points forward to the time when God's manifest glory will again dwell on the earth.
Right.
And who knows, because of the 7th month is so closely tied to key temple events in 1 Kings 8, it is possible that after the Messiah is enthroned on Mount Zion and construction of the millennial temple begins, God's glory will return to the earth during Sukkot, just as it did in the days of Solomon.
Right.
So, yeah, we don't, and he makes kind of a big deal about saying we often think of God as just being a spirit and that we can't see or touch him and all of that. But in some verse in Ezekiel, it talks about the soles of my feet will come into the temple.
Okay, I wanted to read something in the footnotes. I actually had it highlighted and hearted. It says, the notion that God the Father is an invisible, ethereal being only became popular in Christianity after the 1st century with the Greek philosopher Plato, which tends to value the spiritual over the physical. That was his teaching and stuff. So up until that time, they imagined God, and he was in their presence. He dwelled among them. We always say Jesus. We always go straight to Jesus, but they experienced the Spirit of God. So I think that's interesting.
And I think it's interesting because I brought this up to you before we started recording, but there in 1 Kings, it says the priest could not.
I was hoping you would say that.
Stand to minister. And I was telling her, I can't remember, but I think it was Ryan, because you said it wasn't you basically, but I remember someone talking about that the reason that when we read in the Old Testament that, they were moving the Ark of the Covenant and a man reached out because it was going to fall and God struck him dead. Yeah. Well, it's not that God struck him dead. I think that's kind of like if it depending on its exact wording, but that's kind of improper because it wasn't so much that God had to strike them dead, but in their flesh, they were unable to touch the things of God and literally killed them. The power of his spirit being there was too much for the human body, and the human body died. Just like if the mountain, he was on that mountain.
They wouldn't, even Moses couldn't even look at him, you can't handle it, Moses. All I could let you even maybe do is look at the back of my head after I passed by. And what did it do? It made his face glow, for days.
And it says no man can see God and live. And it's not because he kills us. It's because physically in this body, we can't handle it.
We can't handle the truth.
No, we can't. And we will die as a result. Our bodies will perish as a result of being too close. And like even the animals, he said, keep everyone away from the mountain. Do not even let your animals touch it or they will die. And nothing on earth can stand in his presence without being like these priests. That was just the cloud of his glory. That they were still unable to stand, which then you said, that's why every knee will bow. That's why we will fall. And you even see like with Daniel in the book of Daniel and then John in the book of Revelation, they fell. And Daniel said, I was dead.
A dead man. Yeah.
So they could not. And that was just with an angel. So think of God's power. I mean, it's totally overwhelming. So I just think that's a good point. I thought of all of this while I was reading it. So
very good. He does make a really good link to Revelation 21. And again, we're listening for that tabernacle language. But he says in 21:3, behold the tabernacle, and he gives us the Greek word skene of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and he shall be his people. God himself shall be among them. Okay, obviously we can hear that, we can hear dwelling in his tabernacle, but he made a note down. It says, John uses the Greek word equivalent, skene. It's equivalent to the Hebrew word sukkah. So it's not just behold the tabernacle of God is among men. I mean, that's important as it is, but the sukkah of God, the dwelling place, the sukkah, the hut, all of that.
Yeah.
So
and he states here the most important point to note is that the Feast of Tabernacles does foreshadow how the inhabitants of the earth will have supernatural encounters with the manifest glory of God, the Father, in the millennium. So, so it's going to be like really an amazing time that we will be living in. I mean, because like nothing will compare to it. Nothing that we're doing now will compare to actually being in the presence of the Father and the King,
Right.
So
okay. On the last page, we have the entire page highlighted between the two of us. So I don't know what.
Oh, wow, we're already there. Yeah.
244. This is the end of chapter 11. What are some of the points that you liked in the first paragraph?
So first paragraph, I have that starred. So that was it. So it's again, he just says it's a prophetic foretaste of the natural abundance and magnificent joy in God's presence that we will experience in the millennium, which we've been saying. He says, and this is what I thought was interesting. So just as the first 6 days of creation led up to the blessing of the Garden of Eden on the 7th day, the first 6 feasts on the calendar will lead up to the complete blessing of the Messianic age during Sukkot, or the 7th feast, which will in many ways mirror those first experienced by Adam and Eve in Genesis.
Yeah.
So you have 6 days, 6 feasts. 7th day was the first Moedim, the first appointed time, and then you have the 7th feast. So so it goes together like that. When
you know the language of the feast and you go back and you read Genesis, a lot of people say, well, they didn't celebrate that because the law wasn't given to them yet. Okay, well then how does Noah know what animal is clean and unclean? That kind of thing.
And Abel did. I mean, he knew what was what he was to bring.
When you go back and look at the language of it, what's being offered, what's accepted, what's going on in the time frame, there is evidence in Genesis that even Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel understood the Moedim. They understood the requirements of it.
Galatians calls that Abraham was taught the gospel.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting because in Galatians it says that, and I can't honestly tell you which chapter, but that what was the gospel to Abraham? It was Torah. Because
it would have had to be Torah. There wasn't anything else. Right. It would have had to be Torah.
So he was taught the Torah as the gospel.
Right.
And that's the thing that we forget, that the gospel, and again, hear me out before you think I'm being a heretic.
Right.
The gospel's not just about Jesus' death and resurrection. It is about him returning the entire world and all of creation back into Eden.
Okay. You have to think of it this way, because you're saying that, and then the verse that fully comes to mind is, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, it's the power of God for salvation." Okay, when Paul wrote that, there was no New Testament.
Yeah.
Right? The gospel was the message of Christ given to us through Torah and through prophecy and Old Testament scriptures. So you have to, when people spout that and beat that drum, they're not even understanding what is being referenced.
And salvation is more than saving us from hell. Right. It is restoring our health.
It's restoring everything. Right.
Yeah. It's restoring our mental health, our physical, our emotional, our heart, our soul, our mind. I mean, it's restoring those back to good, good standing with the Lord.
The original plan. Yeah.
And that's such a great point that you brought up, because it's about the restitution of all things, and that is what we're looking forward to. And we get to be part of it because Jesus died on the cross and arose from the dead and is sitting at the Father's right hand. We get to be a part of all of that. So that's not, like he talked in the chapters on Yom Kippur in this book about the blood and the power and the strength and the love of God for the blood of his son. And we don't give it enough glory and enough honor, but and definitely so, but it's what that blood does is what is so key to who we are and what the future holds for us. It's not to minimize any of that. It's part of a much larger picture than just saving you and me.
Yeah.
It's restoring the entire earth.
Right.
So,
good stuff.
Yeah, it is. And that's what's, I think, makes Bible study so amazing. It's hearing and being able to see the bigger picture through, through Revelation. We're doing a Bible study on Monday nights, and Lauren's in it too. And talking about the bigger picture and being able to see like that the mysteries of God is about revelation. And and you don't get that revelation if you're not in God's word. The treasure is in his word for us to dig deep for, and then we're rewarded with revelation. So if you're just reading the Bible through in a year, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but you're not going to get revelation that way. You're not going to go deep that way.
Yeah. At the very least, look for the patterns, look for the language, look for, there are very specific key themes. Look for the themes.
Yeah. If you haven't learned anything from us,
that's what we talk about
the different patterns and languages in the Bible.
We say that a lot.
I know.
All right.
I think
we're gonna go back now. We're backing up Back to the Future. Yeah, we're gonna go back to chapter 1 now. And so we hadn't really planned on doing this. We were just gonna jump into Passover, but there's a lot that we kind of skip through quickly, and we want to make sure folks understand why are we even reading this book, and what is the benefit. And
this is going to set us up for Passover next week. You'll be all there.
So how many Moedim are there total, Stephanie?
Is this a trick question?
No.
Okay, so there's 7.
There are.
But then we also count the Sabbath. The 7th day, is also called a Moedim.
Right. And so he has written this book because so many, and I believe this to an extent, believe that Jesus has fulfilled all the way up to first fruits. And that's all the spring has been fulfilled. And then Shavuot, right, Pentecost. And so everybody thinks that all that has been fulfilled, and we're just waiting for just the right moment to line up, and he's going to come and fulfill the rest. And he challenges that a bit. He tells us that there's probably layers of this prophetic acceptance.
Partial fulfillment.
Right. And so we see a hard copy in the Old Testament. We might see a partial fulfillment with Jesus on earth, but then there's a final in the future. And so that's how he's setting up the book. We've said that 100 times. We probably said that 1,000,000 times. But he is going through, and we did talk about the different calendars. We've mentioned that. We did talk about Rosh Hashanah versus New Year's versus, how it's kind of weird how on the Hebrew calendar, it's not really the beginning of the year, but it's the new cycle of the Moedim. So we're trying to understand that.
Right.
And how it does relate both spring and fall, both relate to harvests, and how dependent we are on the harvest. I think the one thing I wanted to kind of talk about was, the view of Jesus fulfilling everything later, at his return. I love this kind of stuff. That's
Are
only
you on a certain page?
I'm on page 8.
Okay, me too. Okay.
Yeah. It says, but unfortunately, the popular view of these feasts of Jesus fulfilling these things has really only been around since the 1970s. And so folks prior to that, they didn't really give it a second thought of Jesus completely fulfilling it or not fulfilling it. And so they looked, people of earlier times looked forward to Jesus fulfilling everything and understanding that. So what else? I did want to talk about, we had a thing, let's see, page 14, but I don't want to skip too far ahead without covering some of the other stuff before we get there.
Can you hear my dogs?
I can.
Something. They saw something. So he makes a point, staying with what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Every feast has 3 layers of meaning, and that's on page 10.
Right.
So, and he said, as we were learning this book, so if you think Passover's been already filled, we've only seen the first 2 layers. We haven't seen the third.
Right.
So he says, Scripture never says certain feasts have been fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
We see that word and we think done, like it's all done. Just like when we read that Jesus says, I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
I had come to fulfill them. So we think, oh, one and done. And that's not the meaning of fulfilled. Mm-hmm. It does not mean done. Right. So Scripture never says certain feasts have been fulfilled already, whereas others will await their final fulfillment.
Exactly.
The biblical writers never connect the spring feast only to the Messiah's first coming and the fall feast only to his second coming.
Right. Which is very common. I mean, we totally teach that a lot, and so I guess,
yeah, and he gives it. He goes, there's a historical meaning to ancient Israel.
Yes.
There's a first century fulfillment through the work of the Messiah.
Right.
And then a future fulfillment, which we've been talking about, a future fulfillment tied to the end time events and the Messiah's second coming.
Mm-hmm. I wrote down when I was first reading this, and only because we just came off the book of Esther, when we were reading through it, and I think I mentioned this before, we saw 3 fulfillments in Esther. I mean, it went through 3 different fulfillments, and so that it's not an uncommon idea.
Many things with Mordecai were paralleled with the work of the Messiah.
Yeah.
And then with the 10 sons, he went into the future and what's still to come. So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So then some of what we've already talked about is in here, but I have a lot kind of underlined on 12 and 14 too.
Mm-hmm.
So he just says right at the top of 12, a better approach is to accept that every feast in Leviticus 23 points back in some way to what the Messiah has already done, while also pointing forward in some way to what he will accomplish when he returns and sets up his kingdom.
It's the whole point, right? Mm-hmm. I highlighted just below that where it says, to the surprise of many, the Apostle Paul also taught that the biblical feasts in Leviticus will only reach their final prophetic fulfillment after the return of Jesus. And he quotes Colossians 2:16-17. Paul writes, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are mere shadows of what are to come, under the substance belonging to Christ. So, and we've seen that language of shadow of to come. Paul uses that often. I mean, we see that often.
And this verse, of course, as you know, these 2 verses are always taken out of context. That mean, don't let anyone judge you for not keeping the Sabbath. Don't let anyone judge you for not keeping the feast. But he's actually saying the exact opposite. Don't let them judge you because you are
keeping
the feast. Don't let them judge you because you are keeping Shabbat. And don't let them judge you regarding what you're eating or you're not eating as far as keeping God's commandments. So, he was talking to Gentiles who were pagan people who ate and did whatever they wanted. There was no law, no moral law to them.
Right.
So now he's talking to people who are converting
Mm-hmm.
and coming to know the Messiah. So they were being given a hard time because they were changing their diets. They were celebrating the Lord's feast instead of the pagan feasts. So,
Right.
So you have to keep it in context of what was actually going on with these people and who he's talking to.
Exactly. Page 14. I don't want to just read the whole page, but the whole page is important, I think.
Well, yeah, I think we should. Good. So if you want to take the first three, and I'll do the second two there.
Okay.
Right.
He just says the biblical feast and the return of Jesus. And this is the whole premise of his book. It's wonderful to get the historic aspect, but this is the meat of his book. It was written to answer this question in a thorough manner, and I hope it will help move discussion on the feast to a new direction. To give an overview on the front end of where we're headed, so we've already done part of it, below is a summary of the prophetic fulfillment of the feast that we will cover. So we're about to go into Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. Those are the first. Messiah will return as a greater Moses, a divine warrior, a miracle worker, and he will rescue Israel from captivity, lead a second exodus through the wilderness, and defeat the forces of evil with a series of Passover plagues. And again, look at the model that's already happened. Right. That's what we should expect for the second one. And I've been hearing a lot in a lot of conversations just about this second Exodus.
Yeah, and we did a study on Revelation at our church, and I say church, I just say it because that's the word of
assembly or congregation.
Yeah, so whatever, if you're more comfortable with congregation, that's what it is.
That's what it is.
We call ourselves whole Bible believers because we do everything from Genesis. We do everything. So anyway, my point being is that I've been corrected. I've been corrected many times. Don't use the word church. I'm not ashamed of that word. But I got off on a rabbit trail. But on Revelation, he actually went through, Ryan taught that, and he compared it to the Exodus. So if you think about the Exodus, there were things that happened just in Egypt, like with the plagues. So some plagues just happened on Egypt. Some plagues never, like the whole country of Egypt. And then some plagues never hit the Golan Heights. Is that where they were? No. I forget where were they, but the Jews where they lived, where the Jews were.
Okay. There wasn't
it never touched them. So there were certain things that certain of the plagues never touched them, right. And then certain plagues were only on the disobedient. So when you see it lined up like that, that is exactly what we see, the same pattern in Revelation. Yeah. So we see some that happens just on the city of Babylon, like where the anti-Messiah, Antichrist puts his throne. So some happen there. Some happen across the board on everyone in the whole world. Right. And then other areas are protected. And the people of God are not affected. So you see the same plagues, and he actually will go into some of that, and you see some of the same plagues that are happening in the Exodus, and the whole wilderness thing is in Revelation, right?
Cool. Yeah. Very cool.
So sorry, I kind of intercepted
that. No, I think it's great. It's great. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is weeks. And this is after, and again, we're trying to look at the historical, the pre-millennial timeline, because all of this happens after the tribulation, after the battle. All of that's all within that time, but it is pre-millennial because it's before the millennial kingdom actually is established and goes. So weeks is after Jesus' return, there will be a great harvest of souls and spiritual revival. The nations will be gathered to Jerusalem, and the Spirit of God will be poured out on all people, and the renewal of the earth will begin. So, and we've talked about this. How is it a rapture, or is it more of a harvest? Is it a caught up because I'm getting snatched out of here, or am I being caught up and driven to Jerusalem? So there's different ways to look at it.
To safety. Yeah.
Yeah. Trumpets is Israel and the nations will attend Messiah's formal enthronement. We've talked about this just recently. Ceremony on Mount Zion. And at this time, the nations will hear the great trumpet blast that announced Jesus is king, the Messiah, king of the Messianic age. And he will, from that point on, extended his justice and rule over the earth. And so we just finished the trumpets for sure. So
yeah. So the next one is atonement. So think of it again, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The land of Israel and its people will be cleansed of all impurities. So remember, for those who didn't hear that chapter,
yep,
yeah, it wasn't just about cleansing the people of their iniquities, but it also was cleansing the temple of its iniquity, as far as what the uncleanliness of people and the uncleanness, I should say, not cleanliness, but just the sin and uncleanness of the human race. The temple was kind of infected. So it was, so again, be cleansed of all impurities. The space for the Messianic temple will be anointed and consecrated, and the Messiah will begin his high priestly ministry on the earth. Right. So there will be a point in the future, after like the, what we think of Armageddon or something like that, that this battle will leave many dead, will leave, like it's going to look worse.
Didn't we even read there was something, it'll take them 7 years or something to bury the dead, if I remember. Yeah. We always think, we've talked about this before, we always think like Jesus will return and it's all done, and let's go. But he puts it more of a longer timeline.
Yeah, because things have to be cleansed before he builds his temple. Because the land will be full of rotting bodies from a battle. And then tabernacles, which we obviously just finished. The earth will experience healing and agricultural abundance like never before. Israel and the nations will feast and rejoice in God's presence, and his glory will dwell among his people forevermore. That's the good news. So, so again, he actually goes in a little bit of his own life and his theological studies. He's been doing this, like studying this kind of stuff for 20 years. And so I think we even said that his wife is a Messianic Jew, but I would actually, at the very end of the book, he gives like his links, and I went and checked some of them out, because I thought, he'd be a great guest for my podcast.
There you go.
But I couldn't find any way to contact him. But anyway, bummer. Yeah, but he, I mean, I think they like kind of do, if reading between the lines, he talks about, you can actually find him on X and follow him there if you want. But, and he'll put up posts. He put up a post and showed his little sukkah and stuff like that. And so it was fun kind of going through some of those posts. I wasn't stalking him, I promise, but just to see what, what he has to say about everyday life, how he's living this out.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, okay. Do we want to talk about premillennial on 17?
Yeah, maybe we can probably
we've always
some of this. So
we've always jumped on it saying like it's a stance on the book of Revelation, but not so. It's just a time period. Premillennial eschatology is characterized by the belief that Jesus will return to this earth after a period of tribulation and set up an earthly kingdom for about 1,000 years, and after which the point of final judgment of all living things will take place. I mean, I think everybody kind of believes that. I mean, that's pretty standard, I think.
Yeah. Well, I have heard people who don't, but there's a millennial.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And that's okay. I mean, I think we all have things wrong about our theology, and we'll all see it play out before us and know where we were wrong.
So. We'll see the answer sooner or later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know if there was anything else.
We just have a couple minutes, but on 18, I just had a couple things there.
Okay.
It says the nation of Israel will be the central hub of God's activity in the future. So if you don't know that,
Yeah.
It's all about Israel. It will
He
always be
uses the
about
word.
Israel.
He used the word Israel-centric.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jerusalem will be the capital city of the Messiah's kingdom,
Mhm.
and the eschatological
Yes.
fulfillment of the biblical feast will highlight the centrality of the nation of Israel within God's redemptive economy. I'm sorry, I just cannot talk. So yeah, and then you said the centrality of Israel in the unfolding plan of God is simply connected to God's covenants with the biblical patriarchs and to every nature of Jesus himself.
Right.
So it's just, I think we just don't even consider, it is not about the United States of America.
Yeah.
And we talked about that in the Restitution of All Things when we did that book, that it is not about us. It's not about Russia. It's not about
China.
It's about the Middle East. That is the hot spot, and it will always be.
I don't know if you read this. So we have a second on the bottom of 17. The nation of Israel, they're more specifically, it more specifically pertains how God will complete his plan of salvation for the Jewish nation. Mm-hmm. We must approach the feast from an Israel-centric vantage. That's where he talks about that. Seek to understand how they will reveal what Messiah will do for the Jewish people after the second coming within their geological homeland and territorial boundaries of the Middle East. So, I mean, we've got to remember that. That aspect.
It is about them, whether we like it or not, whether you think it or not. The Bible's very clear that everything will come back to that area of the world, and it will be centered there.
That's right.
His kingdom will be centered there. His throne will be there.
He is coming back as a Jewish king. Yeah, his temple will be centered there. So
yeah. So we're not finished. Obviously, it feels like we're finished because we just did the last chapter.
No, we're not. We're just going to start
next week.
Yeah, so Passover next week, and then we'll be back on track. And again, if you're early, you read ahead, you're fine. So,
thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. If you missed today's show and want to watch it again or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find this show and all of the other live Lamb show archives on the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Stephanie Pavlantos, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.